Standing in for Sally G, who normally does this. She unfortunately can't be here. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tom Hargreaves to the SCI, to the University of Manchester. Many of you know Tom, but for those of you who don't, he's a lecturer in environmental science and policy at the University of East Anglia. I thought you were a geographer come sociology.
Yeah,
we probably need to,
that's a better description.
We need to work on that title. Tom probably has a natural audience in the Sustainable Consumption Institute insofar as his work kind of deals with many of the same theoretical and substantive issues that we are interested in. His work focuses on how innovations of various sorts, technological and otherwise, designed to promote sustainability impact upon people's everyday lives. He's published widely around a variety of themes, including the application of theories of practice to the question of pro-environmental behavioural change, the integration of the multi-level perspective and theories of practice. There was a paper that I really liked. We did the rounds with it a bit, didn't we? On the application of Freiberg's phrenesis.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
I like that. But he has considerable expertise in energy consumption, particularly domestic energy consumption, and the relationship between so-called smart technologies and their users. So that's what he's going to talk about today. Without further ado, I'll hand over to him. Tom's going to talk for about 40 minutes. He's happy to take questions as we go, so long as they're of the kind of short and clarifying kind. And then we've got plenty of time at the end for discussion. And then we're going to go to the pub afterwards, to the salutation. Everybody's welcome to join. So, welcome, Tom.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. I'll try and make that keep it to 40 minutes if we go to the pub afterwards. That sounds very good. Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks very much for the invitation to come up here. I think David's right in that hopefully the work that I do does have something of a natural audience in SCI, and that's partly because I'm directly trying to speak to and speak with lots of the work that's coming out of the SCI and the people around this room now, and I'm very inspired by lots of the work that goes on here, so it's really nice to be able to come and talk to you about the stuff we've been doing. I'm going to talk today about one research project I'm involved in, which is called the REFIT Project. I'll say a bit more about that later, but I should preface this by saying it's not entirely my own work. I'm working closely with both Dr. Charlie Wilson and Dr. Richard Hawksworth Baldwin, both at UEA, and they're both with me in the Science Society and Sustainability Research Group, and also the Tyndall Centre, which is Charlie's sort of main home, I guess. So they should get at least some of the credit for some of the stuff, and they should get all the blame for any errors, inconsistencies, inaccuracies, and so on. Right, so a quick kind of outline of the talk then. So I'm going to talk about smart homes. I'm hoping that a lot of you will already know what smart homes are, so I'll try and whiz over that a little bit. But what are smart homes? Why do I think they're interesting or important, particularly in relation to energy use and sustainable consumption? Talk a bit about the REFIT project, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And then I'm really, the kind of empirical kind of content of my talk today is going to focus on three different bits of work within the REFIT project. One around a systematic literature review and how do we understand users of smart homes in the academic literature. One around a content analysis of industry marketing materials about smart homes. And then the stuff that I would really welcome actually help and comments and advice on, because it's the stuff I'm really thinking about now and it's the most kind of it's emergent as I'm talking through it, is really trying to think through how can we understand ICT use and by extension smart homes in everyday life. And this is where I'm going to talk a bit about how we're using theories of practice and so on, and then talk about some emerging conclusions. So what are smart homes? Again, I expect a lot of you will know this, but essentially these are the kind of very common images you tend to see of smart homes, and you can see at the bottom here the big list, and if you can read it, the resolution's not brilliant, but they consist of a range of different things, all the way from motorised curtains and automatic pet feeders to security systems, lawn moisture sensors, door sensors, all sorts of different sensors to understand what's going on in the home, which are then combined with some kind of intelligent agent, is the idea, that actually based on its understanding of the state of the home and its users, tries to make some kind of decision in order to achieve some kind of goal, some kind of aim, which might be security, energy use, and so on. Generally speaking, smart homes have three kind of core elements. Context awareness. This is a network of sensors, a network of monitors that sense what's going on in the environment. Feedback and user interfaces. Somehow the information that those sensors gather and collect is made sense of and presented to users in such a way that they can hopefully change what they do or make sense of it, understand things. And then this kind of more automated aspect, the intelligent agent, the intelligent control and automation that automatically responds in the way that users have deemed to be optimal, desirable, or so on. This is one particular take on it, Richard Harper, who argues that what makes a smart home smart is the interactive technologies that it contains. So for Harper and his folk in the Microsoft Research Labs in Cambridge, the focus is really about interaction between people and technologies. And this is probably a take that I quite like. When you see images like this, there's a focus much more what my computer science colleagues tell me an intelligent home tries to avoid interaction and do decisions for people, whereas a smart home is actually not as smart as intelligent, but we can talk about that for what's the difference between smart, intelligent, wise, and what have you. But so this is kind of what are smart homes, I guess. So why do I think they're interesting? Why should we be concerned about or interested in smart homes? How do they relate to energy use particularly, which is kind of my interest? One core component and one of the main ways in which smart homes are marketed and sold to people, which I'll talk to you a bit about in a minute, is through home energy management systems. They're presented as ways in which we can radically reduce our energy use and carbon emissions and decarbonise our energy system through a range of different means that can be done automatically for us. Things like optimising energy efficiency in the home, things like turning lights off when no one's in the room, things like turning the temperature down when people leave one room and turning it up in the room they move into, things like making sure the heating's not on when no one's home, things like not turning the heating on an hour and a half before someone gets home when it only needs to be on 10 minutes before they get home to get the room to a desirable temperature, and so on and so forth. One of the major concerns is about using energy efficiently. A second central way in which smart homes are presented as able to save energy, save carbon and so on, is through automating responses to price incentives, real-time tariffs and so on. So actually allowing demand response to occur more automatically and more efficiently. So actually the home will be able to sense what energy you're using and actually can respond to, can cut things back when energy prices are high and actually use things when energy prices are low. So we can automate that sort of thing. And then the final way in which smart homes are presented as important and interesting from an energy management perspective is linking the home to the wider smart grid through smart appliances, through microgeneration technologies, so they can sense, for example, when's the wind blowing, well now I need to use electricity from my wind turbine rather than from the grid. They can sense, for example, that your next door neighbour might have some electricity left over in his car battery that you could borrow at that particular moment in time because he or she isn't using it. So they can actually connect your home to a wider community in order to optimise the use of low carbon electricity rather than high carbon electricity. Now, estimates vary and they range from the kind of massively unspectacular to the wildly optimistic. But RWE Power, for example, estimates that carbon dioxide savings from their smart home system will range somewhere between 17 and 41%. Right? Spuriously specific figures in a very wide range, actually, I think. But that's what they estimate. And so I would suggest that if this has got any credibility, any basis in any kind of fact, it is something that we should be interested in. So one argument why a smart home is interesting and important is, well, they offer the prospect, the potential, they could make quite a big difference to the amount of energy that we use. But of course there's a big but. There's always a big but in any kind of selling up, because it sets you up for the rest of the talk. Smart homes are also associated with what Inga Rotker and colleagues call the third round of household electrification. Their argument is, and this is Danish data here, the graph, is that particular technologies have been associated with ever increasing rounds and rises in overall levels of electricity consumption. So before the 1950s, back at this end of the graph here, really the only electricity consuming technology that was in homes, is Danish homes, but it mapped quite well onto lots of Western societies, was lighting. So all of this is almost 100%, as you can see here, was lighting. Then between about 1950 and the late 1970s, we had new core technologies around heating and power, the electromotor, which started driving a whole wide range of different kinds of domestic appliances, cooking, laundry, heating, cooling, and so on. So you see rapid rises between 1950 and late 1970s, and that's kind of the second round of household electrification, as they put it. And then the third round of household electrification, as Rotker et al. Have it, is driven by the microchip, and transistors originally, and the microchip, the ability to process data. And so really the growth here from the 80s onwards is mostly seen in this kind of TV, music and computer chunk, and also in miscellaneous at the top. And the argument is that that is really the sector now that is growing much more rapidly. That ICT is driving the next rise in electricity use. So we have two stories here. On one side, smart homes, as part of this ICT revolution, can save energy, can save carbon, versus observed kind of rises in levels of electricity use, driven perhaps by ICT. Rotker and colleagues talk about fun washing of smart homes. Are they really about energy? They claim to be about energy saving, yet they're sold to us because of their entertainment benefits and other things. They're being fun washed. And they talk of them as Trojan horse technologies. These are things where they're sold to us as through their ability to save energy, but actually once we've got them and we start using them, the effect will be vast increases in energy and carbon dioxide and associated carbon dioxide emissions. So really this remains kind of an open question, and this is one of the points that Rotker et al. Make, is that each of these technologies, from lighting to heating and electromotors to ICTs, has led to dramatic changes in everyday life, to social practices. They all made new practices possible, relationships between practices possible, and so on. And yet we don't know yet what the longer term impact of ICT technologies, of this massively increased capacity to process data on the move, what impact that can have on our everyday lives and in association with that in energy use and other resource consumption. So for me, smart homes are very interesting and important because on one hand they're claiming to help us save energy, yet on the other people suggest they're going to have the exact opposite effect. So that's why we wanted to do something on smart homes, and we got some EPSRC funding working with colleagues at Loughborough University and Strathclyde to do the REFIT project. The broad aim of the project as a whole is to explore the use of smart home technologies and trying to use that data that smart home technologies might be able to collect to help people make better decisions about retrofits in the home. What's the best decision for them to make? So it's actually a very functional, quite instrumental model for the project as a whole. The way it will do that is through a field trial of 20 smart homes in Loughborough. So we've done this, it's going on now, recruited homes, and we are kitting them out with a wide range of different smart home kits that's linked to security, electricity use, heating controls, a wide range of different aspects in which they can smartify their homes, as it were. But whilst the project itself is quite kind of instrumental in it, can we gather this information and feed it back and help them make better decisions? At UEA we probably have some more foundational kind of social science questions that are driving our interest in the project, I would say. And this really is about, well, who's going to use these things? And how, if at all, are they going to use them, and with what kind of impacts? So actually we're not perhaps so much interested in the information provision to improve decision making, but more the general questions about, well, what difference do these things make to people? And as I mentioned right at the outset, there are kind of three broad methods that we're employing in this, or approaches. One is a kind of systematic literature review on smart homes and their users. One is around a content analysis of industry marketing materials, and then one is around in-depth qualitative research with these field trial homes. So if you like, it's what's going on in academia, what's going on in industry, and then what's going on in homes. And the rest of the talk today can talk through each of those bits in step. Okay, so visions of smart home users in academic literature. If we're interested in smart homes and their impact on everyday life, on how people use these things, then there's surely a question here around, well, who uses these things and how do they use them? What does academia tell us? What does existing research tell us about it? We did a in-depth systematic literature review. We used the Scopus search database, and we searched, I've forgotten the exact search term now, I can find out if anyone's interested, but it was smart and homes and user and something else which I've forgotten, plus loads of synonyms. Chucked it into Scopus, and it initially came back with 12,940 something hits, which we then whittled down to 150 through abstracts and titles, whittled down to 150 that actually looked relevant to what we were interested in, actual smart homes and their users. So this is a quick analysis of that. We see kind of a rapid rise since, well, really it's about 2006 that it seems to be taking off, a focus on smart homes and their users. And this pie chart here, where are these articles coming from? I mean, we interpret this as really there are three kind of broad areas within academia that are interested in these sorts of questions. On one hand, the biggest chunk is computer sciences and engineering. These are kind of the tech development guys, if you like. And that's very much the dominant focus. There's a smaller focus, the green chunk there, on medicine and health, and particularly this is interested in assistive technologies and smart homes to support independent living. And then a much smaller chunk on sort of social sciences and energy. So this is kind of the area that we're working in, but as you can see, it's much smaller niche within the broader understanding of smart homes and their users. So what does this kind of work tell us about users? How do these three different bodies of work on smart homes and users actually understand users? What are they saying? So I'll start with the dominant narrative, if you like, which is very much kind of users in the technological and engineering literature. And this quote from Das et al. Is quite representative, I think, of the approach to smart homes and their use in this body of literature. The goal, unquestioned goal, is to create a home that acts as a rational agent. The agent seeks to maximise inhabitant comfort and minimise operation costs. Very little understanding of what comfort might be made up of or how people understand that cost, but that is very much the kind of rational aim of smart homes. How do they achieve this? Through developing, it's very much the vision I set out up front, developing context awareness through appliance use. So here's Parker tell us that you've lots of lovely quotes about how smart homes are inevitably going to make our lives so much better without any real questions about what better might mean. Intelligent home appliances can provide an awareness of user needs, providing them with a better home life experience. And generically, it's just going to improve things for us. We don't know what those things are, but it will get better through the application of smart home technologies. No real question about what these users' needs are, how they evolve and change, how actually interacting with smart home technologies might change them. One kind of, I guess the only way in which they perhaps do try and engage with users, or at least try and think about what users might think about these sorts of things, is by trying to avoid overpowering users with complex technologies. So essentially what we've got to do in this body of literature is make sure that the user doesn't see too much of the technology, make sure it looks simple, easy to use, intuitive is one of the big buzzwords in this kind of area. And then once we know that, we can essentially make decisions for them based on our understanding of the environment and their behaviour and actions within that environment that we can gather through sensors. So users are understood here to have very fixed and stable needs and wants that then are met through, and what they perform in the home, stable routines and practices, that through a clever network of sensors and technology, through context awareness, we can sense, we can understand what is it that somebody does every Monday at 9 o'clock, what is it they do every Friday at 5:30 p.m. And then we can adjust the home environment to optimise that, to increase their comfort and reduce costs. Essentially, users in this vision are passive. They don't actually engage with technology much at all. They get on with what they already do, and it's normally quite routine and stable. And the smart home operates around them for their benefit to make their lives better. So kind of quite a narrow, if you like, rational, I mean, in many ways this is kind of a rational model of users. So what about users in the medical and health literature, which I guess was the second, slightly smaller, much smaller chunk, a bigger chunk in the social sciences body. Here, a smart home is understood as a residence equipped with technology that enhances the safety of patients at home and monitors their health conditions. Now, as you might expect, in this line of work, there's a much stronger focus on users, because actually it's specifically trying to develop smart home technologies to address particular user needs. But of course, these are users, elderly users or people suffering from particular conditions like being prone to falls, being forgetful, suffering from dementia and other sorts of things, that give them perhaps very clear and clearly circumscribed wants and needs that a smart home might be able to help them with. So Orpwood et al. Argue that we need to understand these users' needs in depth. In order, it's important to get an understanding of the reality within which they work with. This is a dementia case here, rather than assume the designer's view of reality is correct. So there's a desire here to really engage with users a bit more, but only because those users have very particular characteristics that we could understand, that we can then design technology to use better. The story, Accenture focused on this one quite a lot. The reason the plant, I mentioned this, the plants in there, they actually in this report talk about a talking plant to help lonely older people, a plant that you can talk to in the morning and talk back and ask you how you're doing in the morning so you don't feel quite so lonely, so you feel that's one of the many ways in which they think smart homes can enable independent living. Maybe people like that, I don't know. So based on this understanding then, within the medical and health sciences literature, the aim is to automate decision making on behalf of users, right? So again, the user is kind of relatively passive, but they've got quite specific needs, so we can automate on their behalf more easily. Again, users are understood to have largely fixed and stable routines, But the point here is that they deviate from it, if they fall over or they forget something and so on, that the smart home can help it. It can be automatically detected, and it might be able to ring up the relevant healthcare provider or ring up a named contact who can come around and check that they're okay and that sort of thing. But again, they're essentially passive in the operation of smart homes, which may be essential, particularly in cases where people might not be able to interact with the technology. So it's a different model of users, but again, it's quite a kind of shallow one, if you like. And then kind of the big reveal, but which won't be at all surprising to most people, I should think, in this room, that users in the social science literature are quite a different beast again. Here, it is users, rather than technologies, who imbue their homes with intelligence by continually weaving together things in their physical worlds with their everyday routines and distinct social arrangement. Here, smartness and intelligence isn't understood as a property of the technology, but as something that emerges through interactions between users and that technology. Users' lives here aren't seen as stable, predictable, routine, fixed, and essentially the same across time, but characterised instead by forms of emotion and pragmatism. It's not about rational decision making, it's about affect. It's about negotiating lots of competing demands and satisficing. It's characterised by living with other people and being forced to negotiate and compromise on your wants and needs in order to live a happy-ish family life. Characterised very much by breakdowns and unpredictability rather than routines and predictive, regular routines across normal everyday life. So this, the kind of implication for smart home design from much of this literature is a need, rather than making decisions for users based on context awareness or ambient intelligence, rather that users themselves should always be in control. Computers should not make choices for users, but the other way around. So here we have again a very, very different model of users and their everyday lives, where it's about messy, complex, unpredictable, changeable lives, not routine and stable. And there's a desire here for control, really. So a big kind of theme around control, particularly in this cooperative literature, and who is in control of a smart home, not just of the appliances within a smart home, but more broadly using control of different things that go on within homes. So that kind of gives a nice overview, I hope, of the three kind of core bodies of understandings of users in the academic literature on smart homes. And then we kind of thought, well, it's interesting that that's what academia kind of is telling us. But which of those visions, and in what ways, is that getting into the way industry are currently thinking about smart homes? Now, we looked at industry marketing materials. Part of the reason is there aren't actually many smart homes that exist. They are coming, and there's a lovely quotation from Val Haynes down at Loughborough that smart homes are a part of the future whether people want them or not, seems to be the main thing. Very much characterised by a strong technology push. We can develop this stuff and we'll just wait and see what sticks and what doesn't. But so we had to look then at visions of users in smart home materials rather than real examples of stuff that's gone on so far. So we did a content analysis. We used our systematic literature review to develop quite extensive coding protocol. I think it had about 60 different kind of categories within it, with each of which would then link to a series of kind of subcategories and codes. I can only give you a glimpse of that, obviously, but I'm happy to talk much more about it or share stuff if anyone's interested. What we then did is we tried to find a more or less representative set of smart home companies, people active in this market. So we looked at the Smart Homes Europe conference in 2012, which was hosted in October in Amsterdam. And there were 360-something companies present at that conference. And we went through each of their websites predominantly, but looked for print material where it was available for anything that actively and explicitly addressed a smart or intelligent home. It had to be kind of both concepts. And immediately that knocked out quite a lot of the companies. Most of them were involved in very particular components of a smart home, but not a smart home, a whole smart home setup. So it reduced quite rapidly from 300 something to 62, well, actually it was 52 that we finally found. Then we became a little concerned that the sorts of companies that go to these big trade shows and pay the thousands of pound delegate fees actually are likely to be much bigger companies. So we should focus instead on a bunch of sort of smaller companies and SMEs that are involved in actually creating smart homes on the ground for kind of real people who go into homes and install this kit. And so we got a very small subsample of just 10 companies, all UK focused, that bumped our numbers up from 52 to 62, but that hopefully tried to cover both the very large companies such as IBM, Siemens, Samsung and so on, all the way down to Eaton Smart Homes, who I think are based in Norwich somewhere, which is great being at UEA of course. So what do we find in this when we put it through our kind of coding protocol? Well, one of the kind of things we looked at is how do they market the benefits of smart homes to users? What do they think people are going to want from these things? And so from our literature, we've identified a range of potential benefits that users might want. And what we find is that there's a big focus on saving energy. That does seem to be one of the, well, actually the most predominant focus across these materials. But there's then a kind of second line of focus on saving time, saving money, and kind of security. Nyborg and Rocker refer to this as a melting pot of different aims for the smart home. There's really no clear understanding yet about what these things are for, but these are kind of dominant themes within them, and energy management seems to be one thing that's leading the way, perhaps. Who are they actually marketing to? Can we identify particular categories of users within these marketing materials that they are talking to? And we'll hear, aside from a niche kind of group of users in the kind of assisted living technologies that is really around elderly or disabled people, generally speaking, there's almost no explicit consideration of who these things are for. They're presented as kind of all-purpose. Everyone should want one of these things. Surely, look at the amazing things it can do to improve your home life experience. So very much an all-purpose kind of market that it's aimed at. Yeah.
Is that really true? I mean, isn't it much more aimed at men?
Probably, but that's kind of hard. How would you code for that? I mean, a lot of what we were doing anyway was kind of wasn't explicitly focused on it, so we were kind of reading between the lines.
You have to see who actually was interested.
A couple of interesting points on that. Almost invariably, when there are the vast majority of pictures of smart homes, we did look at the images. I'm not talking about that today. First of all, they normally don't feature any people at all, and no sign of living in whatsoever. They're almost invariably brand new show homes with lots of glass, very bright, not actually lived in homes. So they're very artificial. There is actually no vision of a retrofitted or real life smart home in these materials. Where people do feature, they're almost invariably a middle class white couple with children, right? So it's a couple, and occasionally older people with their feet up by the fire. But you know, where we talk about where they are explicitly do feature, there's both genders equally represented. So in that respect, no, they don't appeal to men, although I would firmly agree with you that in terms of who might actually be buying into this stuff, it does tend to be a male-dominated kind of market. So all-purpose users. Again, and lots of this is kind of inferred rather than explicit, but what do people, how they interact with these smart homes, what sorts of things do they want from them? Generally speaking, this was about a kind of goal-oriented form of kind of information provision. A smart home will help you because it will give you information to allow you to make better decisions on your energy management, security, or what have you. Wasn't generally about this intelligent home that will learn your routines automatically and render you passive. It wasn't that kind of high-tech computer science vision. It was much more about information provision, rational decision making. With a secondary focus on emotional decision making. Here we were talking about particularly the Philips Dynamite smart home, was the one that sticks in my mind. Allows you to set up your homes to make a fun atmosphere or a kind of, a party mode and these sort of things. So you can set up your home to suit your mood. So less a kind of rational decision making, more a kind of emotional one. And occasionally mentioning that smart homes will help you juggle lots of different tasks, deal with a more pragmatic form of decision making. So users, generally speaking, rational, but some kind of more emotional characteristics emphasised. And then kind of, well, how are they going to actually interact with this smart home? This is one that I'm quite interested in. Within a lot of some of the social science literature, there's a kind of interest in actually getting users involved in the design phase. A lot of the history of smart home development has been driven by hobbyists who make their own home smart just through their own interests in electrical engineering and computer science. But in the marketing materials, almost exclusively, we see that the only components that people are supposed to interact with is the software, the user interface. Where there is these ones that have got both interaction with both hardware and software, it's normally through an easy-to-do, no messy wires or installation process of plugging in smart plugs. So it's something that you don't, that's a specific thing where you do not need to become an IT manager to run this smart home. So you only engage with the software. And then you're not involved in the design at all. Across the board, which you might expect this in a kind of marketing brochure, there's no mention of users having been consulted or included in the design process. All about taking kind of off-the-shelf smart home technologies, which again runs very counter to the history of kind of hobbyists developing their own smart homes. So actually quite a limited engagement with users, only kind of right at the end of the scale. Once you've bought this stuff off the shelf, installed it in your home, you can then engage through the pre-made software, which you can then customise and tailor to your wants and needs, but only after we've kind of finished with it. And then the final kind of bit that's kind of quite interesting, just because some of the work I've done elsewhere on kind of how people negotiate energy feedback in everyday life, is to what extent do they think about users in the home, who actually use it, who gets to control this sort of stuff. And here there was almost no thought given whatsoever to the different kind of dynamics or demands within the household. Basically, whose preferences should count in a situation of kind of co-presence. If we're both in the same room at the same time, I want it hot, you want it cold, who wins? Almost no, not clear or not mentioned in 56 out of 62 materials here. So I guess kind of what we kind of conclude from this, I mean obviously there's very limited attention to users, but where you can kind of draw a dominant picture of users, it's about a rational type of user who's interested in saving energy amongst other sorts of things, lives on their own, doesn't really live with other people, and only really wants to take, so they're interested in technology, but they only don't really want to get involved in the making or the design of it, they just want to take it off the shelf and install it in there and then customise and tailor it. So whether or not that user really exists, of course, is a very interesting set of questions. But that's what industry seems to think from our content analysis. So I've covered academia, I've covered industry, and then the last bit of the work, this is the bit that I'm kind of really engaged in now, and where I really welcome kind of input and thought, is around kind of use of ICTs in everyday life. Now, David suggested that I might talk a bit about kind of some of the theories that we've been using and how we're trying to use them, so I just thought I'd do a bit of a kind of conceptual detour at this point in the talk, and this probably won't be surprising to anyone in this room, I should think. But the dominant model, I would say, of users in the kind of smart policy arena at the moment, and much of the industry, is around users as technology adopters. So I take this diagram from the Smart Meter Central Delivery Body last year, and their understanding is that all we need, people in this model feature only as technology adopters. They're only either early adopters or laggards. They're basically defined only in relation to their attitudes to a technology. The Smart Meter Central Delivery Body sees its role as simply a matter of getting people to say yes and start to use the technology, nothing beyond that. And they essentially see that as essentially linear process of developing people's knowledge of smart technologies, persuading them it's the right thing to do, getting them to make the decision to actually install these things, and then eventually that decision becomes confirmed as they see the benefits of this new smart technology. But so it's a very kind of narrow vision of users, kind of by comparison to some of the things we've seen in the academic literature, aligns relatively well, I've thought, with lots of stuff in the smart home marketing materials. It aligns particularly well with the idea of you take technology off the shelf, and that's really what's all about, just making the decision and starting to use it. But some of the things then within kind of science technology studies that we've been kind of interested in developing these sorts of things, going beyond just that moment of acquisition, decision making, one body of theory that I've been influenced by is around kind of domestication theory. I'm sure this isn't news to you guys. Domestication maybe seems the process through which an artifact becomes associated with practice and meaning, people, and so on. Silverstone and others kind of argue, well, there's 4 stages of domestication. There's a process of appropriation, actually getting this thing. Then there's a process of objectification. When you put it somewhere in your house, how do you actually deal with its thinginess, with its objectness? Where does it sit? Does it sit in the nice nook and cranny between the bookshelves? Does it get in the way? How do you actually kind of put it into your home? Does it fit with the aesthetic? A process of incorporation into routines and practice. To what extent people actually use the thing now you bought it? And then the final, perhaps most interesting process that they talk about, kind of conversion. How does it then change the way you see yourself, your identity, and the way you communicate with the wider world? I'm a Mac user, or so on. So that's what they would argue is a kind of process of domestication. It goes beyond just a matter of saying yes and starting to use it, but actually a much more kind of co-evolutionary process where the technology shapes the user and vice versa. But this body of work, which I think goes a lot further and is much more interesting than some of the technology adoption work, has been critiqued, is kind of very limited. It's been critiqued for focusing on single artefacts rather than kind of ecologies of artefacts within everyday life. It's been critiqued kind of for stopping too soon, as the way I like to see it. It focuses on stability and closure, what happens when something is in the home, then it's kind of interesting, but actually it stops its analysis then. When you've got it in, people are using it, and that's all fine. But actually doesn't focus on kind of ongoing dynamics, how things can be kind of and re-domesticated over time. And then kind of the central and perhaps most persuasive critique, I think, is that it's focused very firmly on the technological artefact itself. and not on the everyday life or the practice in which that artefact is being used. Which of course takes me from domestication to practice. And now I won't say much about this at all. You're all probably very familiar with kind of Elizabeth Shove and others' understanding of practice as kind of 3 balls on a dotted line, images, skills and stuff, and practice are made up of these. I've been influenced recently, and I'm quite kind of... I found some of Lenny Kikuya's work it's a pretty simple re-representation of the 3 balls on a dotted line, but I think actually much more kind of realistic and actually much more helpful when trying to understand incorporation and performative integration of a new artefact into practice. So here all she really does is say, well, there's lots of different blobs in each of these pre-circles, not singular circles, there's lots of them, and they have relationships between them. They're not all involved in every single performance of the same practice, so the same practice might be performed slightly differently in different times. And then the way I've kind of thought through this in terms of ICT, and the way I'm kind of going through it right now, is you can imagine that kind of a new ICT-based artefact, whatever it might be, a smart home interface, gets installed, and so it comes into this blob of stuff. And of course it might have knock-on effects on other bits of stuff. It might make other things, you might have a Diderot effect going on where it makes other things seem outdated. Like for example, as iPads increasingly make laptops seem slow and unresponsive. So it knocks other things out, it changes the understandings of stuff. Similarly, it has knock-on effects within other elements of practice. It brings in new meanings and makes other things seem outdated or new or whatever else. It allows you to develop new skills and pushes out other skills and so on and so forth. And of course it has knock-on effects throughout broader systems of practice. So I've been trying to use this kind of understanding and kind of feed it through some of our initial kind of qualitative data with households, I'll say a bit about in a moment, to really ask about, well, how are new ICT technologies performatively integrated or not into practices? And what is this process and how does it both shape the ICT itself and the practice? What impact does it have? And what impact does it have on other elements and interconnected practices? So as I said, this is kind of early findings. I've not been able to go through this systematic. I've got kind of 3 vignettes to share with you just to finish the talk today. I'd be really interested in kind of your thoughts on kind of thinking through this and how to take it further, because it is stuff that's really going on in my mind at the moment, and actually some of it's been going on the train up here. What we've then done, okay, we've got our 20 homes. Before we've installed any smart home kit with them, we've gone round and done getting to know you tours, interviews and video tours with these 20 homes. We've asked them about their everyday routines, how do you use your home, and we've asked them about technology, all sorts of different technologies within that. How do they use technology in their normal everyday lives, from mobile phones, iPads, computers, to squash rackets and bikes and sewing machines and fish tanks. The actual smart home study is to follow. That's kind of going on as we speak. What I'm working on here is kind of ICT, focusing on different forms of information and communication technologies as a proxy for smart homes. To what extent can we learn about how smart homes might impact on practice through understanding the ways in which people engage with information and communication technologies already? And I know that that's not necessarily a direct comparison, and that's something, again, I'd be very interested in talking to people about and getting your thoughts on. So as I said, 3 kind of just quick vignettes to finish off then. Henry, sailing, the iPad, sailing, and killer Sudoku. So I'm interested in kind of how is it that ICTs change practices and change relations between practices, change the elements of practice and so on. Henry wants an iPad, right? And he wants an iPad for quite specific purposes. Really, he wants it so that he can bid at the very, very last minute for sailing equipment on eBay whilst he's in the pub. He gets quite annoyed that he misses out on the items he wants at the best price because he has to bid. He goes to the pub, I should say, he goes to the pub every Tuesday and Thursday. He used to go Wednesdays and Fridays, but Fridays have got too busy. He doesn't really like interacting with this. I'm not a very sociable person. So he wants the iPad because he was getting annoyed that by bidding 10 minutes before he left and not being able to bid out the pub, he sometimes missed out on things. So he wants an iPad to help him get that best sailing, to allow him to engage in sailing whenever he wants, even in the pub, wherever he wants. But he's also adamant that even if he buys an iPad, he won't use that in the pub to play games, particularly the killer Sudoku, which is what he always does on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the pub. Because he wants to do that from the newspaper, partly because he feels the newspaper is more authentic and real, partly because the landlord, he thinks at least, gets the newspaper in specifically for him to do the killer Sudoku in. Right, okay. So kind of a silly story, right, but an example of how one guy, Henry, who's actually a bit of a computer whiz, he kind of knows all about built these sorts of... He has what he describes as an archaeology of computers in his upstairs study. So for Henry, in this particular example, what we're seeing is the iPad serves to sort of delocalise and what you might call kind of temporarily fragment, i.e. it means you can engage in sailing in small doses at any different time. His sailing practice, right? He can move it around in time and space. He can take it with him into the pub, which he could never previously do. But it also serves, I would argue, to sort of stabilise and reinforce his practice around going to the pub and kill a Sudoku. It allows him to carry on doing them when he wants, at times that he's happy with and convenient with, precisely because it allows his sailing practices to move around in time and space. What it also then is doing is kind of reducing the boundaries or the friction between all of these three different kinds of practice, kind of sailing, kill a Sudoku and going to the pub. It allows him to do them all in the same place at the same time at the touch of a button. All he needs to do is he can bid on his iPad there and then get straight on with the kill a Sudoku. So there's no kind of, he doesn't have to go on a 15-minute journey from one to the next. It's much easier to switch from one practice to the next without any real friction. It brings practice together. So that's one example, and it hopefully gives an example of how we're trying to think through the impact of ICT on practice. Let's look at another one. So Jason, Cara, Ellie and Lola are a family, and they talked a lot, they're really into their ICT, they've got loads and loads, they're kind of just drowning in it seems. They're an incredibly busy household. Each of the two girls does a different after-school club every day, gymnastics, trampolining, music lessons and so on. They spend their entire time, it seems, running around, and in order to cope with that they describe themselves as having very fixed routine. They talked actually about dealing with their home life to almost military precision. It has to be such a difficult life to manage. But here is Ellie, who was, I think she was 11, maybe 13, talking about them watching TV. They place a lot of, despite their busyness, or perhaps because of their busyness, they place a lot of importance on family time, right, spending time together. Even though they're all the time, all over in different places, therefore the time when they are together becomes more and more important. So Ellie talking about them in front of the TV. We'll be sitting there and we'll all be watching Grand Designs on the TV whilst Mum's doing a game on her phone or something. Lola will either be complaining about Grand Designs or doing some gymnastics. Dad will either be upstairs watching something or in the room looking at the BBC News on his phone. And then I'll probably be complaining about Grand Designs, not wanting to watch it. They talked a lot about what is called multi-screen activity. They're all supposedly watching Grand Designs in the TV room, all sitting around. It's very common, probably. You'll probably have this in your own everyday life to some extent. But lots of different things going on. And all mediated by the phone that allows them to do this sort of thing, engage in different practices whilst ostensibly watching TV together. So what we see here, how can I kind of perhaps a quick analysis of it? iPads, Kindles, smartphones, laptops, you name it, seeming to be used in this particular example to kind of actually promote co-presence. They actually allow all these people to be in the same place at the same time whilst doing all sorts of different kinds of things. I've got the Stalker app in there. This is just a kind of funny aside. This family talked about an app they call this. It's called Life 360. Have you heard of it? They call it the Stalker app because it uses the GPS sensor on your phone to tell you where anyone else who's signed into your group is at that exact moment in time. And the dad talked proudly about how it allows you to shave minutes off when the tea's on the table or when the cup of tea is ready. You know exactly when Cara's going to be home. They talk about it as the Stalker, but it's a way of them understanding where they all are and allowing them to maximise their time together. So they're using multiple ways to promote co-presence. And so an argument here I would suggest is that what this family seems to be doing, ICT seems to be kind of delocalising, and even perhaps, although I'm a bit wary of this term, kind of individualising practice. It allows them to kind of get in their own individual practice bubble and not annoy the people around them who want to engage in other practices at the same time. It allows multiple practices to occur in the same place at the same time, and thus reinforce and restabilise the importance of family time. So again, some things are moving and shifting, other things seem to be actually being reinforced here, depending on which practice you're looking at. Okay, the final one, probably the least interesting, Julia and Louise, iPads and smartphones. Julia, who's recently retired, used to hate technology, that's her words, not mine, but has now embraced it, particularly her iPad, because she thinks it now kind of aligns well with her, or it seems to align well with the new meanings she associates with retirement. She used to hate it when she was at work and on computers all the time, but now she can use it to talk to her friends, chat, or coordinate meetings, coordinate her hockey and badminton, her socialising, her lunch meetings and so on. So she's embraced her iPad. She's even taking a training course in how to get the most out of her iPad. Louise, also recently retired, however, has a very, very strongly different kind of response to her mobile phone. She very definitely does not want a smartphone. I don't have a smartphone and how to work a smartphone, but I really don't want a smartphone. I'm going to have to get one eventually, I guess, when the world revolves around everybody having smartphones. I think that's mad, but there you go. We're of a generation that didn't grow up with these things. We don't need them. So we've got very, very different approaches to smartphones and the way and ICTs and the way in which they may or may not be incorporated. Different associations with them may or may not be incorporated into practice. Again, this is, as I say, probably the least interesting example, but the adoption and use of ICT here is kind of obvious point. It's clearly mediated by the other elements of practice. It's not just about the technology and your decision about whether that technology is going to help you or not. It's about what meanings you associate with the practices you engage in at that particular time, the extent to which the ICT enhances them, aligns with them or not. It's about what skills you use. Can you actually use this sort of stuff? Are you able to develop those skills over time? Okay, so there's just three kind of vignettes that I'd be really kind of keen to get your thoughts on that and kind of talk through that a bit more, because that's where my kind of head's at the moment. So emerging conclusions. So from the kind of first bit of the talk, I guess, there's clearly, it seems to me, kind of inadequate attention being given to users in their everyday lives in existing research, industry and policy understandings of smart homes, and by extension the whole smart agenda. Qualitative research seems to align that we've been doing seems to align quite well with the social science literature, unsurprisingly, on smart homes, in that it seems to describe and capture some of the messy, dynamic and complex nature of everyday lives. But these are exactly the things that aren't accounted for, aren't included in the policy and research and industry narratives that I accounted for earlier. When we look at them, the last bit of the talk, ICT use, it seems to be mediated by the different meanings of practice. Now, what we might do with that as policymakers is kind of obvious, but it perhaps provides a broader palette of intervention. It's not just about technology adoption. It's not just about converting laggards or encouraging early adopters. There'll be lots of different ways in which we could think about getting ICT into practice or not. But some of the more interesting and broad-ranging impacts, perhaps, is that we see ICT seems to be delocalising and temporarily fragmenting some practices at the same time that it seems to help reinforce and stabilise others. And I think an interesting question that we're yet to address, and I'd like to take further, is, well, which ones and why? Which practices? Is there any particular shared characteristics of the practices that can move, as opposed to those that don't move? Similarly, on the elements of practice, are there particular meanings or skills or artefacts that are associated with keeping ICT out as opposed to welcoming it into practice? And then the final one I would suggest here is kind of ICT seems to be reducing the boundaries and friction between practices. It enables more practices to be engaged in by more people more of the time. And of course, if you take the idea that resource consumption occurs in practice and through the performance of practice, this has very worrying resource implications. Okay, final slide, and I'll shut up for a bit. One thing that, this is just talking about extending this idea. We've got smart ICT as a proxy for smart homes, but one thing that troubles my analysis here is how do we then extend this to actual smart homes? What's the difference? Smart homes definitely introduce ICT equipment into practice as part of practice, which is what I've mostly spoken about so far. But smart homes also serve, I would argue, to sense, monitor, automate, schedule, remotely control and coordinate across a whole range of different practices, which is a different kind of thing perhaps to what we've been seeing so far. Does that change the dynamic? Does that change things? The overall impact of interventions they'll have on end user life remain to be seen, but the kind of obvious conclusion for me is that the smartness of smart homes, to the extent that it will emerge through their integration or not into a range of different practices and their knock-on effect there. And I'll shut up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Any questions?